Television Studies here at USC. Ellen is the author of books including Sold Separately, The Internet Playground, and she's currently working on a new book that's going to address issues of intellectual property law. So please join me in welcoming our moderator for this discussion, Ellen Seiter.
Well, I feel really lucky to have three good friends and lively, entertaining speakers to be able to talk informally this afternoon about issues about studying the media. So let me, what we've done is we've circulated a few questions in advance. We're going to kind of take turns answering some of those, talk among ourselves for maybe 40-45 minutes, and then take questions from the floor. So first I want to introduce Nitin Govil, who is in the Department of Communication at University of California, San Diego. He did his PhD in cinema studies at NYU. He is the co-author with Toby Miller of Global Hollywood and Global Hollywood 2. And he's working, he works in the area of comparative media. He's working on a book about Hollywood and India and co-authoring a book on the Indian film industry. And next we have Jennifer Holt, whom some of you might remember from when she dazzled our undergraduates here, setting an incredibly high bar for 191. She is did her PhD at UCLA and is now at the Film and Media Studies Department at University of California, Santa Barbara. Her book, Media Industries History, Theory, Method, came out last year from Blackwell. I know, as a point of fact, it has proved very useful and influential to some of the people in this room. And her next book is forthcoming from Rutgers University Press, Empires of Entertainment. It's about deregulation and media conglomeration from 1980 to 1996. And finally, Toby Miller, who's now at UC Riverside, but has previously taught at NYU, at University of New South Wales, Griffith University, and Murdoch University. He is in the Department of English, Sociology, and Women's Studies, probably a pretty unique job description in the academic world. And he's the author of many books, including the television genre book, Global Hollywood, as I said, Sport Cult, Sport Sex, Globalization and Sport, not to emphasize the sport profile too heavily, The Avengers, Contemporary Australian Television, and The Well-Tempered Self, Citizenship, Culture, and the Postmodern Subject. So, let's be entertaining now because it's almost 5 o'clock and there's a party after this. I asked people the panelists to start out by, in part because our department does not, at USC we don't always have economics or media industries component. What might, in the course of your own history of studying, what made you turn from more traditional film studies or textual analysis, film theory, to thinking of media industries?
Jennifer.
For me, I think a lot of it is personal, right? What kind of person you are and what kind of information you gravitate towards. And I never really was excited about philosophical or theoretical thinking, but I was really excited by historical thinking and practical matters, and I have attorneys in my family, so I think if I wasn't a professor, I would have been an attorney. Mm-hmm. And so this is kind of, I don't know, just kind of where my mind naturally went. And I feel happy when my feet are kind of grounded materially, dealing in matters of industry. I get, my brain just doesn't function at a high level.
That is overly modest.
No, I mean, thinking theoretically,
Yeah.
I think my skills are just more suited to this type of study, and also nobody was doing it, and it in my cohort anyway, where I was doing my PhD, and most people were in a very kind of philosophical or theoretical
Yeah.
mode, and so I don't know, I was happier being the person doing my own thing than I don't know. I don't have really a glamorous answer other than it's how I think. Do you have a more
Okay,
glamorous
Toby,
answer?
how about you? Go next.
Well, I never studied any of these things, so I don't really have an answer.
What do you mean? You
About-
haven't studied media?
I never. No, I didn't. I've never
Yeah.
taken a single class in
So what did you
any
study?
of these topics.
Yeah.
I worked in these areas, and then I discovered that I could get an academic job professing something that I didn't know you could study. So I'm not the right object for this.
So,
I'm not trying to be difficult, but it's just I didn't have to be converted from bullshit
okay,
to bullshit.
so I have to read
I
here.
was bullshit.
I left out a part of Toby's bio that's, that says, after working in broadcasting, banking, and civil service, Toby Miller became an academic in the late 1980s when cultural studies was starting its boom and was able to parlay a combination of his work experience, theoretical interests, and political commitments into a new career.
That's the answer.
So there you go, okay.
No, but I do have an answer to this that I would have had I studied it, which is that because I used to work in it, I worked in radio, as Ellen said, I was a speechwriter, I also did acting. I'd done all these things, and then I discovered you could study them, and I truly hadn't realised this at all. And I was interested, and one of the things that interested me about the difference between, as I understood it, I had a very vestigial understanding, let's say, of something that hadn't yet arrived that I thought was actually in regress, but in fact was alive. I was struck by the fact that whereas my friends who'd studied literature in college didn't know how books were made, didn't know how books were sold, didn't know how books were reviewed, didn't know what books physically were, couldn't describe them, other than sort of holding them. Here's my latest.
He's got 14 more.
People
If
I
you ask the right question, he'll throw one in.
People I met who studied the people I met who studied the media, whether they were in any of these other departments that existed that I'd never heard of, like film or communications or whatever, they all knew what film was physically. They knew its history as an object. They knew how it was sold. They knew who owned it. In other words, they were interested in the totality of its life as an aesthetic object, as something that was created, as something that travelled, as something that went on to be perceived and then had another life of interpretation. This struck me as extremely interesting and much more valuable than this bizarre world of the book, which came from nowhere but just told verities. So I was struck by that. And therefore, the idea of there being a choice or a trajectory from close reading to what is the biography of these objects wasn't there for me. I was very struck by the fact, as it seemed to me, that that was already present, actually, by contrast with literary studies.
My answer is, in terms of, Ellen, you're asking about a turn from textual analysis. I studied with Toby at NYU, and Daddy wouldn't let us play in the sandbox. So that's one of the reasons. But I do think, this question in some ways is, it's an interesting question because it's a new way to cast the debate, right? And so folks know that, in the 80s, 90s, there's these juxtapositions made, political economy, cultural studies, et cetera, and there's this new sort of textual analysis, political economy, and I understand why, and these things show up they show up, especially, Ellen and I were talking about job visits, right? They show up when faculty members ask you questions, and they're trying to figure out, where are you? Are you one of us? Are you one of them, right? And the us and the them are colored, gendered exactly the same way as you would expect. So I understand politically, strategically, where these distinctions come from. But I want to say that there's, for me at least, and I don't know if I'm speaking for other folks here, but there's much more of a continuity between these types of things. And I think that the field itself, if we want to think of a field at all and that connects what we do together, is not necessarily a sort of rejection of textuality, but a kind of a disaggregation of textuality, and a kind of it's a more expansive kind of notion at this point. And maybe, since a lot of us are interested in media practices, this is the way in which textuality has re-entered the debate. So I agree that it's perhaps, in terms of the practice of textual analysis, that may have involved a certain sort of hermetic, close analysis, sort of monk-like, maybe we pray at a different church. I'm not sure, but there's still close analysis being done. So I want to make sure that we aren't sort of over smart and say, oh, we just don't do that. And I think that there's a lot of continuity, and in terms of, if we think about what does textuality mean in the contemporary, and I think that that's something that all of us are interested in.
Well, but what would be to you, say, some common or even frustrating criticisms that you encounter when you present your work, or say book reviews or things like that? What kinds of critiques do you get that you have a chance here to answer in front of witnesses? Come on, anybody had a bad review?
Yeah, no, sure. The books I wrote with Toby. I think that, I had, can we talk? Can we talk for a minute? I had a bit of a hard time, Toby knows, on the job market early on, and this, I would encounter these kinds of, when people are trying to figure out, and it was after Global Hollywood had come out, and there's a very strong argument there. It's a provocation about textual reductionism versus economic reductionism, and a sort of attempt to try to think things in more complicated ways. But people are trying to figure out camps, and I think it means something to a particular generation of media and film scholars. If you work on the industry in a particular way, it means you compromised things in a particular way. I think Jen was too self-deprecating when she talked about aptitude being one of the barriers. I think sometimes that's what gets thought of, and it's a lot of fun to be in these rooms when you're asked this question. I got asked a number of job talks. What are your 5 favorite films? People just trying to figure out, do you watch movies too? Or are you just looking at reports and policy documents? So it's, and this hasn't gone away. This has not gone away. So I think that's, these are the politics of disciplines and how people align themselves to certain forms of life and how they get reproduced in certain occasions. And we see that in journal reviews and as well as sort of ad hoc conversations as well.
I think of a couple things come to mind. One is when writing about, particularly the issue of ownership. I find people are desperate for me to be overtly political in my assessment of developments, and I don't feel compelled to do that. I think what I'm really interested in is legal history and policy history, and I think I must be really frustrating to some people in the way that I try to get around that demand of, I don't want to say whining, but, like ranting against